I'm with Tom Kibasi, who was the lead author on Chapter 4 of the CMO's report, which is, I think, Tom, I could just describe it as in inverted commas social health, which is really... What was the aim of the chapter? What were you trying to achieve with that?
We're trying to make an argument that health isn't just... We've known for a while health isn't just biological, it's also socially determined. This is taking the argument on and actually saying that health is a social construct. It's about the relationships between people, not just the circumstances that they find themselves in their lives.
I thought it was a really interesting chapter, and there are two standout things for me in the chapter. The first is something that's been picked up in the media since. I'm not sure that I think the CMO's report actually kicked it off, but that's what do we do about our kids and social media. And you're proposing, I suppose loosely, a regulatory regime.
Yeah, we are. So we talk about duty of care in social media platforms, and actually I was part of something called the Commission on Economic Justice at IPPR, which was set up. We had the Archbishop of Canterbury, all sorts of people on it, and we proposed regulating the big tech giants. We think these are very powerful companies now. Monopoly-sized companies in other sectors are regulated. We think that the same should apply to these kind of big tech players.
Are they too big to regulate?
Well, no. I mean, why would you say that about any other?
Well, access to them. For example, let's say we'll say Facebook.
Sure.
Other platforms are available. Nothing against Facebook, but just to use them as an example.
Sure.
If we got to the point where the British government decided that Facebook wasn't something that we wanted for our kids, we could say, okay, we deny you the opportunity to broadcast or do whatever it is you're going to do in Britain. Or England, it would have to be, because of the devolved responsibilities in Scotland and Wales. People would just pick it up from elsewhere. I mean, I was in Iran a couple of years ago, and they banned a whole load of social media platforms, but you could still get around it by changing your IP address. So I don't see how you can do it.
Well, so I think, firstly, I think we're not saying ban anything, right? We're saying let's have a modest, sensible regulatory regime where we want these companies to succeed and to flourish. We just want them to also behave responsibly across a whole range of different dimensions, and care for children is just one of those. So we talked about establishing an office for digital platforms, just like you have an office for water regulation or any of the other regulatory structures. But how do you do it? Well, these companies, fundamentally, their revenues arise in the UK, so they need to be able to do business here because the revenues for their advertising come from here. So actually there is a opportunity to regulate precisely because the revenues are coming out of the UK market. So if it was not, if they were in breach of their license, they wouldn't be able to collect those revenues, and then it wouldn't really be the issue about could someone access it. Well, yes, they could, but the company, if it wasn't prepared to comply with the regulatory regime in the UK, wouldn't then be able to collect revenues here.
So would you fund the new regulatory regime body, whatever you're going to call it, from their revenues?
I probably wouldn't. I've never really liked that model, in part because I think it puts the relationship too close between the regulated and the regulator. I would go for a general taxation funded model, and I think that these companies also need to start paying their taxes. Facebook globally says that it's got a profit margin of 50%. Facebook in the UK says it's got a profit margin of 5%. That's clearly an unacceptable.
Yeah, but until there's a global agreement on how these organisations that straddle geographical boundaries are going to be taxed, you're going to put your money where it earns the most and is taxed the least. They're going to do that. I mean, you can't blame these companies for taking advantage of tax opportunities elsewhere.
I find that a really weird argument, in the sense that I think just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. There are all sorts of things that I can do that I probably shouldn't do. And just saying, well, they can, therefore it's kind of acceptable what they do. I agree, we need to change the law in order to deal with that kind of behaviour. But I don't think we should just brush it off and say, well, of course our companies will behave irresponsibly. We should have higher expectations of each other. Our proposal is for an alternative minimum corporation tax, where you say, look, we're going to tax you based on your revenues in the UK, assuming the same profit margin. So Facebook, we'd say, fine. We're just going to assume that if you report a 50% profit margin globally, then we'll assume you're making a 50% profit margin here in the UK, and that'll be the base on which you're taxed. And if we're wrong, and if the UK market is uniquely unprofitable, open up all your books, show us all the numbers, and if you can prove to us on an open book basis that you shouldn't be taxed at that rate because your profit margin is lower, then that's fine. But I think you've got to start to change some of this stuff. People are very unhappy in this country, and quite rightly so, because they know that some people are doing so much better and others aren't. You know, since 2010, for the first time in recorded history, first time ever, the relationship between economic growth and people's weekly earnings has been broken. So now, as the economy's growing, most people are no better off, and they're just not going to put up with that for much longer.
Just switch the emphasis a moment away from the regulatory aspect of it and just look at it in terms of editorial content. Sure. The whole spirit of the internet is that, you know, if I want to put something on the internet and share it with everybody I can, I'm my own editor, I'm responsible for what I put up there. Now we're saying, well, look, Facebook and others are publishers, and we should treat them in the same way that we treat any other publisher of any other media. Is that what you're saying?
We need to find a model that works, but I think if you take somewhere like Germany, for example, right, it has a stricter regime,
yes,
and it has a vastly disproportionate share of Facebook moderators are in Germany and German language speaking, precisely because the legal regime in Germany is different, and I don't see why we shouldn't protect our kids. And also, at the end of the day, right, take that example of Facebook. It's making 50% profit margins. So for every £10 of revenue, it's making £5 of profit. The idea that these companies can't afford to fund enough moderators to protect our kids is just lunacy. And I don't understand why people insist on defending the indefensible.
Let's go from kids to the other end of the scale. There was a wonderful phrase in your chapter, the sure start for retirement. And I have to say that strikes at a personal level. Someone who's retired 3 times and I'm still going. But tell me about it. I think that's quite exciting. I like that.
So look, so for most people, those moments of transition are really the difficult things, right? So the first transition, the early years of life, you know, when the sure start sentence sets up, you know, that's the first transition into the world, as first transition, right? That transition from being in full-time education into work is another challenging transition. The transition for becoming a parent for the first time, big transition. The transition we focus on there particularly is that transition from working full-time to being retired. And it's thinking about how can you help and support people through that process of transition. So, you know, having the conversation about, well, how do you want to spend your time now? How are you going to stay active? How are you going to stay socially engaged? What are the opportunities to participate in community groups? Where could you? We know that people who are live happier and longer lives are those that feel connected to other people. You know, where can they do that? Actually, service, right? People who feel that other people rely on them and do things for others tend to be much happier in retirement. Where are the opportunities for volunteering? So I think it's about creating a structure, a service where people can be just helped think through that period of transition.
It's a really unique idea.
I can see it, but I think it's also about trying to say to people, you know, that as we lead these longer lives, right, it might be the case that we need to just think much more carefully about that transition from work to retirement. So, for example, stepping down hours progressively over time rather than just having this kind of cliff edge, well, you've hit retirement age, now you stop.
And it is interesting, isn't it, that, I mean, quite a lot of people now who will be thinking about retirement and coming through baby boomers and so on, they would have had a life where they've been fundamentally well nourished, they wouldn't have experienced war, they wouldn't have a legacy of an industrial past to worry about. The likelihood is that a lot of us will approach older age much fitter, much more active, and whilst there's this sort of shadow of dementia that hangs over everybody who's getting old, but the fact is that a lot of people will be still young.
Yeah, exactly. And how do you make the most of their talents and everything they've got to offer, but while also giving them a chance to have a different phase of their life that is rewarding and meaningful and all the things that they want it to be. And I think a little bit of help for people in that moment of transition, you know, getting it off on the right footing, I think would be really powerful.
Tom, listen, thank you for sparing the time to talk to us. It's a really interesting chapter. There's a lot of great ideas in it and a lot of analysis, which I thought was very thoughtful and interesting. So thank you very much. Chapter 4, make sure you read it.